Hello and welcome to week 14. Wow, is this semester gone by? Beep beep zip dang. Okay, we are in chapter 15, but before I go into chapter 15, what I want to remind you of is that this week we have our major assignments due. This is your information literacy paper or your service learning paper. Please be sure to get those into me this week. As I posted, and I will post, haven't done it yet as I'm recording this video, but I will be posting an announcement that I will not be extending the due dates on these final projects. That all semester. So, okay, let's move into chapter 15, psychological disorders, probably one of the more popular areas to study within psychology. A majority of psychologists actually work with individuals with psychological disorders, and when anybody says that they're a psychologist, most of us think that this is what they do, is dealing with psychological disorders. So we're going to approach the question here. First of all, when we think about abnormal psychology, abnormal means against normal, against normal. So what is normal and what is abnormal? And the world of psychology has methodologies to make that distinction, and those methodologies are based upon three criteria. The first is statistical abnormality. The second is abnormalness in relation to sociocultural norms, and abnormalness that gets in the way of major life functions. So we're going to take a look at each one of these and kind of run through what does psychology mean when it's talking about abnormal behavior, particularly in a world where there's all kinds of diversity of behavior. And I'll talk about the importance of combinations of these. When we have all three of these going on at any given time, that's when we might be in the most trouble. So first off, let's take a look at statistics. Statistics of any behavior, if we actually graph them on a frequency distribution, intelligence, money, basketball skills, the number of hallucinations you have per day, we would essentially see a graph similar to this. And I want you to look that in the middle, the mean, the average is, there's a lot of people represented in that middle part. You can see like 68.26% of the population hovers right around the mean, actually one standard deviation above and below the mean. And then we have 95.44% of individuals are within 2 standard deviations of the mean. And finally, we have 99.72% of the population is within 3 standard deviations above or below the mean. Now, when we are looking at abnormality, depending on the particular behavior, we use statistics like this to make determinations as to how common something is. And if something's really common, well, it's more normal than it is abnormal. Now, keep in mind, this is just the statistical tool. So if statistically something is very rare in that, the 99.72% don't have this, they don't act this way, they don't have that behavior, then we say that that's abnormal. We would say abnormal behaviors are rare, and they're the ones that exist in this far-reaching area here. That doesn't mean that they're not violations of norms or that they don't get people in trouble, but they might be very common. There's actually a very common form of depression called dysthymia that is a low-grade blues type of depression. I don't mean the guitar playing type of blues. I mean just down, just feeling unsatisfied. Right now, there's a huge population in America that is suffering from the symptoms of dysthymia because of the pandemic, because of threats to the economy, because of political uprising, because of all the discussions on Facebook and all those things can get people feeling pretty down. And so right now, That's not rare. It's not rare to come across somebody. You walk into somebody and you say, "Hey, how you doing?" And they feel, "Not that good." That's not uncommon right now. That's actually probably more the rule. We're in a situation that is causing us to stretch our resources, and all the more important to engage in self-care skills so that when we do finally get on the other side of this pandemic, we can be mentally healthy. Okay, so returning to my slideshow here, we're going to start looking at norms. Now, what do we mean by norms? And it always refers to culture. Now, culture, as we study it in sociology, exists within all societies and all groups within societies. So let's first off talk, there are norms within your family, there are norms within your town, norms within your state, norms in your nation, norms in your religion, norms in every different group that you belong to. All of those have overlapping and sometimes very distinct norms of behavior. So when we look at abnormal behavior from this perspective, it's behaviors that would run against the expectation of a given group to which you belong or that you want to belong. Those violations can be violations of norms themselves, normal behavior, expectations of values, what you think is important and not important, and then expectations. And these expectations are going to relate to function in just a little bit, but expectations are the behaviors of individuals within a culture, let's say a group, that allow them to operate efficiently. So let's say you were part of a snowmobile club and your behavior was very commanding and demanding, and the expectations of everybody in the club is supposed to be, very getting along, being nice to each other, and as a member, you start harassing people because they own a Polaris and you think they should own a Ski-Doo or something like that, one of those brand kind of arguments. And you're violating the expectations of that person, of you in that role of being a member, and it may jeopardize your membership. Most social groups, most societies have a way of social control, mechanisms of social control that identify when you're acting out and remind you in any number of ways, be it tap on the shoulder and say, good talking to, or going to jail, depending on what norm and what part of society you're in violation of. So abnormal behavior can also fit into this category, where your actions are either violating your family or a group that you belong to or our society's norms for behavior. What that leaves us with is the last one, and this is having to do with function. This is probably the one that really reaches out to us. I mean, certainly cultural norms and whatnot really tend to make themselves known when people act in bizarre manners. But ultimately, it really does come down to function. Can the person survive in their world? And again, I'm going to borrow from sociology and talk about two terms, status and roles. Now, in all of us within each one of the groups in our society that we are in occupy a number of statuses. I, for example, can say I'm a husband, I'm a father, I'm a brother, I'm a teacher, I'm a citizen, I'm a member of a board of directors, I am a member of a band. Each one of those is a job title that I have. And each one of those job titles or statuses has a job description, and that's really what these two terms are about. So we have status, which is the job title, and roles, the job description. And the question is the behavior that you have interfering with your ability to do the job that you have, the various functions that you have? You could be a mom, dad, a student, work, your role with friends, managing money, taking care of yourself, even your own personal safety. Can you do these things, or does your behavior get in the way of these? And if the behavior does get in the way of these, then we would consider it abnormal. And so that's kind of the way that we approach the definition of abnormal within the field of psychology. And there's all kinds of abnormal behavior, both positive and negative. I mean, certainly someone who is extremely good at money or managing money or figures or we think about those brilliant scientists who were kind of a little off the rocker a bit, but yet they had extremely good abilities. So abnormality doesn't necessarily mean just one end of that curve, that negative part. It could also be abnormal, like too smart, or when we say too smart, we're sort of implying that maybe their intelligence gets in the way of some of the practical aspects of maybe their functioning or something like that. So that's how we approach defining what is abnormal, is that a behavior meets any one or any combination of those criteria. Now, a mental disorder is one that meets one or two of these particular areas. A mental illness, as categorized in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders, right now in edition 5, all three characteristics are probably activated by those behaviors, and we also add some additional criteria that the condition is chronic, that it persists over time and persists in a daily or a cyclical fashion, and that it's pervasive. And pervasive is one of the interesting words to look at when we think about the functioning component of abnormal behavior. When we look at the word pervasive, when we're looking at mental illness and we're looking at its impact on function, we're looking at mental illnesses have a tendency to disrupt or interfere with nearly all of somebody's function. They're so persistent, they're so chronic, they're so severe that they interfere with many, if not all, aspects of their functioning. As I have in this graphic here, they may interfere with sleep patterns, washing and dressing, family, getting paid work, even volunteer work, leisure activities, involvement in sports and exercise and self-care, friends, going out in public and shopping, even eating. That these things all together, the severity of a mental illness as opposed to a mental disorder, is that they have this pervasive quality. Now, pervasiveness has two sort of approaches that we take in terms of treatment. One is the biological approach, and the other is psychosocial. So I'm going to talk to you now about the characteristics of treatment that we engage in from these two perspectives. Now, we understand that an individual with a mental illness has, in many cases, an identifiable biological component to it. It's not in isolation. It is always within a cultural context. It's always within a context of available resources. There's all kinds of ways in which a person exists in our world with a mental illness. And these two forks of treatment, one being biological, like a general term for that particular approach, and then one being psychosocial, and that particular approach to treatment, work in coordination with each other to provide the best opportunity for those individuals to, the goals are to be out of the institution more than you're in the institution, to avoid those disruptions, and to be able to function in the environment of your choice and accomplish goals and seek happiness, just like everybody else. And so those are the goals of both ends of treatment, both the biological approach and the psychosocial approach. So let's take a look at those. Under biological approaches, we focus on reducing the symptoms. The problem itself is located in the biological disease, and just like any other disease, a heart disease or arthritis or a broken bone, we're trying to return it to normal functioning. Less symptoms of pain, less symptoms of mental illness, the same sort of approaches. We approach those with medication and therapy and other forms of treatment with the goal of reducing symptoms. Now I'm going to compare that to psychosocial treatment, which is different. The goal here, success, is less symptoms. Therefore, if you think about this from that, if they have less symptoms, then the level of their illness may be statistically less rare. They may not violate as many norms of their culture, and they may be able to function again because the symptoms that were creating barriers are now alleviated. Now, at the same time, we are also approaching persons who have mental illness from a psychosocial point of view. Now, the psychosocial point of view accepts first and foremost that the symptoms may persist. In fact, most often they do. So even while you are working to reduce the symptoms, you still have to live. And so part of the goals of psychosocial rehabilitation in this particular sense is to focus on living with their symptoms, providing strategies to adapt to the existence of those symptoms in your life. Now, the rehabilitation approach, as opposed to the biological approach, locates the problem. It has to do with where you're locating the problem. The problem in the psychosocial approach is in the environment. The individual has a behavior that is not conducive to, let's say, a work environment. So while we are working on a medication and therapy and whatnot to reduce the symptoms, we can also work on the work environment to create a more accommodating and accepting place for that person to work. So you can see how both of those can work in effort with each other. So while the individual is working on strategies to reduce their symptoms, they're able to go to work now, be able to engage and be motivated to get up in the morning, actually, to have something to do. That independent living model of living outside the institution and pursuing goals and whatnot, despite symptoms. But sometimes you might need help in adapting the environment, teaching the environment, changing, adapting the environment in order to accommodate for the needs of the individual with a mental illness. So we focus on barriers that exist within the environment. Now, I use that word barriers. You have this relationship between symptoms and barriers, but it is a reciprocal relationship. The symptoms activate the barriers within the environment, and we can either change the symptoms or we can change the environment, and that's essentially this dichotomy here of biological and psychosocial approaches. And finally, the goal here is happiness, goals, and less disruption in their life. Now, and the key thing to look here is look at the goals on the bottom here. We have less symptoms, happiness, goals, and disruption. Of course, we want both, but someone can be happy, achieve their goals, and be less disrupted by their mental illness and still have the same level of symptoms. It's truly possible. So both of these approaches to mental illness are very, very critical. Now, I spent a large amount of my career, just about a year ago, I became a teacher longer than I was a social worker type person. And so this is now the longest part of my career. But prior to this, I worked for a very long time in the mental health field, working with individuals on the psychosocial side of things, helping people to identify the symptoms within them and how they interface with the different environments in which they want to act, and finding out how those environments can be accommodated in order to support their particular existence in the world. So a person, let's say, for instance, who had tremendous anxiety, particularly in going out and being in crowds, kind of what we used to call agoraphobia, but an anxiety disorder, having to go out. The individual still has living skills. They still have to interact with their neighbors. If they're living in an apartment, they still have to take care of their bills. They still have to get food into the house. They still have to seek entertainment and friends. And then we would say, okay, given your symptomology of being highly anxious about going into different environments, now working in coordination with a therapist who might be challenging them to try those environments, the person working on the psychosocial end will say, well, in the meanwhile, how can you get your groceries? And just that, when you think about going shopping, when grocery stores started going 24 hours, what a gift that was for individuals like some of my clients, where we would schedule to go shopping at 11 or 12 o'clock at night when there was nobody there. How cool was that? And they could engage in shopping, the minimal amount of people that they had to interact with, and they could still get their own shopping done. And then maybe over time, working with the therapist on the reductions of symptoms, things acclimate to an earlier and earlier time for them to go shopping as they become used to and develop the skills needed to interact with people, more people, when they're around them. And we could use the same approach for friends. Yeah, we might want you to go on an outing or a movie or something like that. Maybe that's too much. What if we had one friend over and you watched a video on TV? Nice place to start as you're acclimating toward working with the therapist again, and medications and whatnot, acclimating that person so they can enjoy life right now, even in the process of changing. So that brings us to the end of our chapter, and a little bit about assessments here that we'll go into. And we have the discussion where I'm asking you to do some research on the history of treatment. Now, I just gave you this in a current biopsychosocial encapsulated way in which we approach treatment of persons with mental illness. I'm sure you can find some interesting, often horrible examples of our treatment of persons with mental illness and discuss those and how far we have come. We're not where we want to be, there's no doubt about that, but we are definitely further down the path than we used to be, further down the path than we were when I started working in the field, which 1987, when I entered the field. Things were very different than they are now. And so even just in that amount of time, there's been tremendous change in the ways we approach helping with individuals with mental illness. There's also a quiz where I ask you about those criteria of abnormality, the same, statistics and norms and function. And then I want you to get started on next week. Next week, there's an assignment where you're going to create a document that explains a mental illness and its treatment. And so I want you to look at chapter 16 now, kind of get a handle on that, and then you'll be that much more prepared for next week when we have to do that particular assignment. So that's it for today. I hope that you have a great week, and I will see you in the discussion boards.